My father and I had to go back. Back to Uncle Marvel's house. I hated it there. Always had. Or maybe that's not fair. I actually liked his place, but I hated the town he lived in. It was one of those rundown, hopeless-looking lumber mill towns. You drive through what I suppose you had to call downtown in about 30 seconds and see more empty storefronts than active businesses. The whole town felt yellow, if that makes any sense. Like if you left a newspaper in the sun for 10 years, curling and cracking with age. Like cigarette-stained walls in a dilapidated building. That's what this town made me think of. Hate is a strong word for an anonymous, economically depressed town. I guess it's the encounters I've had with the population that really soured me toward the idea of visiting my uncle over the years. On the few occasions I went into the village to buy a bag of ice or some charcoal, I'd be met with sneering faces, suspicious stares, and tobacco spat in my path as I walked into the shop. Once, I'd noticed some shiftless guy fiddling with the door handle and the trunk latch on the car only moments after I'd stepped away. I shouted for him to leave the car alone, and he'd skulked off. Lo and behold, when I came out of the store a few minutes later, the driver's side door had been keyed. The people living there seemed bitter and desperate, just waiting for something decent to come along so they could ruin it. Now, after a decade of dodging the yearly visit, I sat in the passenger seat of my dad's pickup as it rumbled up Route 81 toward Uncle Marvel's house. To most people he was Marv, not Marvel. I suppose his real name was Marvin. I've been calling him Marvel, like some bygone stuntman for as long as I can remember. When I got the news of his passing, I was stunned. Not because it was untimely. He'd lived a long life. I suppose I'd simply taken his presence for granted in that careless, immature way young people do with their extended family. He'd been a fixture of my childhood. Constant. Immovable. And now suddenly, he was gone. Dad was too old now to handle all the particulars of settling his brother's affairs on his own. I came along because I wanted to be helpful, but I can't deny that guilt played a role. I'd had so much fun with Uncle Marvel as a kid. He'd been so good to me, and then in my young adulthood, and I'd done next to nothing to maintain the relationship. Dad steered the car into an exit lane. Soon I began to see the familiar landmarks of Demersville. It was a little strange to be here in November. We'd always visited Uncle Marvel in the summertime. Most of my memories were of his back deck in the warm evening weather. He had a massive combination grill and smoker that he seemed to use every day. He used to call it the mothership because it was a massive apparatus by most standards. It nearly eclipsed the backside of his deck that faced the woods. I remember whenever he'd make us dinner, the grill and smoker would be packed with steak, chicken, ribs, you name it. More than we could ever eat for one meal. I'd graze on barbecue leftovers all day during those visits. When the food was ready, he'd get a mischievous look on his face and hold it until he'd caught my eye. Then he'd gesture to the packed platters of food and say, "That's for us, but this," indicating a single sausage pinched in his grill tongs, "is for him," nodding to the trees beyond the deck railing. Then he'd dramatically fling the sausage into the trees and brush. As a kid, I'd always giggle at the little show. Once I decided to play along and asked, "Who is him?" He'd shrugged his shoulders and said, "Him is the thing in the woods." He was always full of whimsical stories and jokes. It made those summer visits fun, even though I was the only kid around. Years after that, when I was nearly 18, he performed the grill and food ritual as usual. Although he was drinking a lot in those days, so the toss into the woods nearly took him over the railing. After he'd thrown it, he just stared at it, his eyes glassy and red. I thought he was waiting for me to play along, so I did. "Who was that food for, Marvel?" He didn't answer for a long moment. He looked ahead into the trees, a little bubble of spit forming on his lips and bursting with his next breath. If I wasn't so accustomed to his zaniness, I'd have thought he was losing it. When he finally answered me, his voice was different. Small. Alone. It's for him. Him that's in the woods. He took a long pull from his sweating glass of whiskey and coke. I give him more and more these days, but he's so big now I wonder if some night he'll come inside and help himself. I chuckled nervously, hoping he'd give up the act and break the tension that had settled in the space between our patio chairs. He didn't. He downed his drink and began collecting the grill tools and platters of meat. He finally looked me in the eye, saying, "We'd better get on." I thought he looked exhausted, but there was something else in his expression I'd never seen before. Knowing what I know now, I can say for sure that it was fear. I hadn't thought of that particular night in a long time. Now, rolling through the bustling business district of Demersville, that conversation and a lot of other moments began drifting back to me. By the time we arrived at the house, the November sun was already sinking low. The time change last week was still catching me off guard. The weakening light was casting the yard and the dense woods behind it in long skeletal shadows. Uncle Marvel's place looked just like I remembered, though maybe a little worse for wear. A few shutters were hanging crooked, and the porch steps groaned under my weight as I carried a box of cleaning supplies up to the door. Inside, it smelled of stale wood smoke and something faintly sweet like rotting apples. My father grumbled about airing the place out, opening windows even though the chill of autumn was biting. We spent the next hour unpacking and surveying the house. Uncle Marvel's belongings were untouched and frozen in time. It was eerie to see his hat still hanging by the door and his mug sitting on the counter. I tried not to think too hard about how he'd passed, alone in his quiet, isolated house. Just as we were finishing up what we could reasonably accomplish before bed, a knock came at the door. It startled us both. Dad shuffled over, opening it to reveal a man in a crisp police uniform. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from stone. His badge gleamed faintly in the fading light. "Evening, gents," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm Deputy Kraft. Just came by to introduce myself and offer my condolences for your loss." Dad thanked him, shaking his hand. I stayed back, wary of the stranger. There was something about the way he carried himself, like he was on edge, ready to react to some invisible threat. "You'll be staying here for a stretch, I take it?" the deputy asked. "A few days at least," Dad replied. "We've got to sort through Marv's affairs and get the place in order." The deputy nodded slowly, glancing out toward the woods. "Listen, I don't mean to alarm you, but I need to tell y'all something. With Marv gone, the house might attract some unwanted attention." Dad frowned. "What kind of attention?" The officer's brow furrowed. "The kind that comes from people around here who don't know any better. Some of the locals, well, they're opportunists. Some, I guess what you call desperate types. They might think the place is up for grabs now and try to help themselves to anything they can carry off. Y'all want to keep them doors locked even during the day. That includes the garage. And at night, don't hesitate to call if you hear anything unusual." He paused, as if considering whether to say more. "There's a lot of history tied to this town. Some folks around here see it as a point of pride, others as a curse. Either way, Marv helped some to keep things in order. Without him, you may find the town a little less welcoming." Dad thanked him again and shook his hand, but I could tell the visit had unsettled him. As Kraft climbed back into his cruiser and drove off, Dad studied the card with the deputy's contact information on it. Less welcoming? I blustered. Less than what? A viper pit? Dad just shook his head and sighed heavily. This brotherly duty was already wearing him out. That night, we settled in for what turned out to be a restless sleep. Dad graciously acted like he was excited to sleep in the old recliner in the living room, while I stretched out on the couch. We'd wordlessly agreed that neither of us cared to sleep in the bed Uncle Marvel had died in. In fact, we hadn't even gone into the bedroom yet. I don't know if it was a noise that woke me, but I started awake with a gasp. Disoriented for a moment, I looked around suspiciously until I remembered where I was. Uncle Marvel's couch. The same couch I'd seen him fall asleep on 100 times. A baseball game flickering on the TV. That remembrance was interrupted by a heavy thud from outside. It sounded like someone stomping on the planks of the deck. I glanced toward the window that opened onto the deck. The glow from the garage floodlight spilled dimly through the blinds. My first thought was, Dad must not be able to sleep. He never could the first night he traveled. I figured he was reading out on the deck. I glanced at the recliner and was surprised to see him there, deeply asleep and snoring softly. This was an unwelcome development. If it wasn't Dad, there was someone on Marvel's property who shouldn't be. I remembered the cops' warning earlier that night. Unwanted attention. Desperate types. Then, a distinct metallic bang sang out. I glanced at the chair again, amazed my dad hadn't woken up with that noise. I felt a shock of outrage burn through me, and I sat up, glaring at the window. Uncle Marvel was the only decent thing about this piss ditch of a town before he died, and now his neighbors were going to loot his place? No. Not with us right here. I stood and took a few tentative steps toward the back of the house. It wasn't long before some of that indignant bravado began to winnow away. I wasn't exactly equipped to handle whatever hillbilly was skulking around out there. They could be drunk, or worse, I thought, weakening. I took a quick glance out the deck window. The deck was empty, but my eye caught something that made me look again. The grill, Marvel's so-called mothership, looked like it had been moved. It was angled in, toward the house, instead of flush along the back rail of the deck. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill down my spine. I turned away from the window, suddenly feeling exposed standing there. I wasn't about to go charging out into the night, unarmed, to confront whoever, or whatever, had been stomping around out there. By the time morning came, I wasn't sure if I'd actually fallen back asleep or just lay there half-conscious, listening for more sounds. The thuds and bangs didn't come back, and I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. But when Dad and I stepped outside after breakfast, the sight on the deck froze me in place. The grill wasn't just moved, it was ruined. The metal crumpled inward like it had been struck by a sledgehammer. That wasn't there when we arrived, was it? I asked my dad. He didn't answer. I stared for a moment, trying to remember, but nothing about today felt solid anymore. The lid was warped and buckled. The front panel torn loose and dangling like a broken mailbox door. One of the legs was bent at a sharp angle, the entire structure leaning precariously. There was what looked like claw marks raked across the side, deep enough to peel the metal. "Are you kidding me?" Dad muttered, stepping closer. "What the hell did that? A bear?" I just continued staring at the marks and shook my head. Dad sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "All right, we're getting through today and then we're leaving tomorrow. This place..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't argue. Honestly, even one more night here sounded like a bad idea to me. That evening, I paced the house, pausing at each window, looking and listening. Anytime I heard the slightest indication of movement outside, I'd hiss, "Did you hear that, Dad?" Each time he'd reply, "No, hear what?" It seemed to me he was all too keen to not acknowledge the possibility that we might not be alone on this property. He stayed in the living room, rubbing his bad knee and muttering about how he wasn't going to hobble outside in the cold. "I'll call the deputy before I go outside," he concluded. We watched an old John Candy movie playing on the TV for the next 90 minutes or so as the dark settled in. By the time the credits rolled, Dad was asleep. Looking at him, I noticed how vulnerable and frail he looked. The little O of his mouth, as he pulled in breaths, gave the impression that he was scared of something, maybe in his dream. It was only 9 p.m., but it felt later. The early sunsets continued to mess with my head. Suddenly, I heard a faint rattling, sustained and metallic. What was that? It was coming from the garage, without question. Peeking out the window over the kitchen sink, I had a clear view of the garage. The door had been raised. It sat half open. A black rectangle leading to the garage interior stood out against the floodlight glow. "Dad, wake up!" I barked. "Call the cops! There's someone out there!" "What?" I heard him stammer as I raced out the room toward the back door. Earlier that afternoon, I'd left a crowbar I'd found in the basement beside the door. I grabbed it and stepped outside. I listened for a moment and heard something fumbling around in the garage. I took off around the corner of the house. As the garage came into full view, I pulled up short and watched as Uncle Marvel's table saw began sliding out from the half-opened door. It slid, in 6-inch bursts, until it was clear of the door and into the driveway. Immediately, a wiry man scrambled out and stood, looking satisfied, beside the saw. He looked like a stiff breeze could have knocked him over in his bulky work coat. He began struggling to lift the saw, grunting with effort. His back was to me, but I could hear him muttering under his breath. "Hey!" I shouted, gripping the crowbar tightly. The man startled, whipping around to face me. His face was gaunt. His teeth looked like miniature gravestones. For a moment, he just stared at me, like he couldn't decide whether to run or charge. Then his gaze dropped to the crowbar in my hand, and he took a shaky step to the side. I don't want trouble," he crooned with a sarcastic grin. Just thought it was abandoned is all. Does it look abandoned?" He hesitated, then set the saw down clumsily. All right, I'm going." He raised his hands in mock surrender and backed away. I heard him have the gall to snicker as he disappeared into the trees behind the garage. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. When I finally lowered the crowbar, I noticed something on the ground near where the man had turned the corner of the garage. At first, I thought it was just caked dirt, but when I stepped closer, I saw the prints. Not footprints. They were too big, too deep, and shaped like nothing I'd ever seen before. 4 long, clawed toes had pressed into the dirt, each one the length of a pointed finger. I didn't have the wherewithal to stand there any longer and process what any of this meant. The intruder, the noises, the grill, and now these absurd prints. There was a reason this town was dying. I found my dad standing in the open deck doorway. "Did you call?" I asked. I saw him notice the crowbar in my hands, and a skeptical look came over his face. "You didn't call, did you?" I snapped. "I had no idea what you were talking about," he retorted uselessly. "What's going on? Did you really need me to bother that cop at this hour?" "I just chased off some townie trash. He was stealing Uncle Marvel's power tools. Yes, call him. Get him out here," I exploded. "Well, he's gone, isn't he?" he snarked. I felt like I was going crazy. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that my dad had basically seen and heard nothing of what I had. I began again, trying to muster calm in my voice. "Dad, the guy basically laughed at me. I have no doubt he'll be back, maybe with friends. Now he knows how much money is just sitting out there in that garage. I saw the expression on my dad's face darken. Perhaps he was finally accepting that this was a real situation that had to be dealt with. He walked off toward the living room, presumably to find his phone. I stood, hunched over the counter for a few moments, thinking about how quickly we could get out of here if we had to. Headlights lit the living room and swam across the wall as a car raced up the driveway. "Is it the deputy?" I asked breathlessly. "I still haven't called him yet. I couldn't find his card until just now," he said with an apology in his voice. The truck came to a skidding stop in front of the garage. We stared hopelessly out the kitchen window as two men ambled out excitedly. I recognized one of them immediately. It was the creep who wandered into the woods not 15 minutes before. The driver turned and stepped toward the house. "We know you're in there," he crowed. "You can stay put and hide under the bed. Or you could come out and get yourself stabbed." Without turning to my dad, I whispered, "Call the damn deputy." He began dialing as he stepped back into the gloom of the kitchen, away from the window. I was watching the two men heave the table saw into the bed of the truck. While the first one lifted the garage door the rest of the way, the spokesman of the pair began taunting us again. "Everybody in town seen the fancy car you drove up in. Don't tell me you really need any of this gear. You probably don't know how to use any of it anyhow." "Deputy Kraft is on his way," my dad offered gravely from behind me. As if our inaction served as a response, the man outside bellowed, "Yeah, that's what I thought. Chicken shit." I could hear the mushy, alcoholic quality of his voice, and it sounded like that last sentence had been said in cursive. In spite of myself, I was taking offense. I have a temper, and this inbred mess of a human was getting under my skin, fast. Without thinking much at all, I strode to the door and stepped onto the deck, deaf to my dad's shrill protests. "Hey, Cletus!" I barked. "The cops are on the way, so go ahead and load up your shitty truck and see how far you make it." He looked genuinely shocked to hear my voice. I watched him, staring first at me, then back at the truck and garage, frantically attempting the calculus of how to get out of here with as much loot as possible in the little time he had. The wiry guy I'd seen first sidled up to his partner and whined something about seeing a pressure washer behind the garage. "Then go get it, and let's get out of here," the driver shot back curtly. As the first man jogged around the garage, I remained, locked in a staring contest with the pickup driver. I could see the contempt in his face, but also anxiety. I knew this guy would rather be gone with the stolen power goods than waste time coming up to the house to confront me. If he was having an internal debate, it was ended abruptly. A maniac scream erupted from behind the garage, sharp and desperate. It was cut off mid-shriek by an inhuman roar so loud it rattled the deck railing under my grip. The other man whipped around, his bravado evaporating as he stumbled back toward the truck. I leaned out over the deck rail, trying to see what was happening. Suddenly, a dark spray of blood painted the back corner of the garage. The wiry man's limp arm swung briefly into view before disappearing behind the building, yanked out of sight like a rag doll. "What the hell was that?" the driver shrieked, spinning back to face me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "What you got out here?" I couldn't answer. My throat had locked up. All I could do was stare at the corner of the garage, waiting for something. Then, a hulking shape moved into the faint glow of the floodlight. It was impossibly tall, hunched over as if trying to fold itself into a space too small for it. Its skin, or fur, was matted and dark, blending seamlessly with the shadows. But its eyes were unmistakable. Two beads of yellow, glowing like embers as they fixed on the intruder. I finally managed to clear my throat and weakly offered, I would get into your truck right now." He bolted toward the driver's side door, but the thing moved faster. It lunged, crossing the distance between the garage and the truck in 2 strides. The last thing I saw before I ducked back into the house was the thing's massive hand, or claw, clamping down on the cab of the truck. "Dad!" I screamed, slamming the door behind me and locking it. "What is it?" he stammered, dropping the phone. "I don't know," I gasped, trembling. "But it's out there, and it's killing them!" The sound of screeching metal filled the air, followed by another roar, louder, angrier. Then came the screams, high-pitched and agonized. I grabbed the crowbar again, though I had no idea what good it would do. "Deputy Kraft, he's coming, right?" Dad nodded, his face ashen. "He said he'd be here in 10 minutes. "I don't know if we have 10 minutes, I muttered. Something slammed against the side of the house, hard enough to rattle the windows. I backed away, dragging Dad with me. I scooped his phone off the floor and pulled him along to the basement door. Giving one last, grim look at the window, I turned and we rushed down. We sat in the dark, under the stairs, terrified, miserable, for what felt like forever. Surprisingly, we heard little else from outside. The sirens eventually pierced the steady chorus of our breathing. Neither of us moved until it occurred to me that the deputy might be walking into this alone. I called 911, and when the operator answered, I unleashed what must have been a Hall of Fame performance as far as lunatic callers go. Once I'd shut up, the woman on the other end assured me that Deputy Kraft was with 2 other armed officers. When the police finally came in, they sat with us in the basement, asking a litany of questions before there was any space to try and explain what I'd seen out there. When the questioning was over and the mess outside had been cleared away, they asked me to sign my report. I was livid when I saw they'd categorized my story as a bear attack. Eventually, they placated me by changing it to read, "Wildlife attack of unknown designation." My dad and I almost never talked about it after it happened. I think he was perfectly willing to listen, but I just couldn't stomach the look on his face when I'd talk about the thing behind the house. Sad and unbelieving. Some nights these last few years, I stay up late and pursue cryptid message boards and Reddit threads about uncategorized or mysterious animal attacks. I find a mix of hoaxers and genuinely horrifying stories. I think I know why you don't hear too many of these stories in your normal life. Eventually, the people who lived them just give up and stop talking about it. But they're not forgotten. They're buried, clawing at the edges of memory, because digging them up feels like inviting the thing back.